Welcome to another episode of What's Trading, getting a stalled economy moving again. A just transition on energy takes us where exactly? We all know what we need to do, we certainly know why, but who's leading the conversation on the how? The book is Road Freight Sustainability 4.0, Reducing Carbon Emissions While Improving Profit. Welcome to you. Just talk to me in terms of the just transition. Do we firstly all understand the same thing?
So, thank you for that. It's an interesting question. When you talk about a just transition, there's so many different directions in which the transport industry is being pulled. So on the one hand, you've got the need to provide jobs in an economy that's job starved. And when policymakers look at jobs, they generally look at direct jobs in transport. So, drivers and people in various logistics positions. But what they failed to take into account is the jobs that transport creates in industry. So transport is actually a geographical arbitrage. You have something that has a lot more value in one place than in another place. So you move it from a place of abundance to a place of scarcity. And that's really what transport does. So if you look at industries where transport is very important, you look at things like the automotive sector, the manufacturing sector. So in many instances, transport makes up a significant portion of the automotive cost bundle. So maybe 20-30% of the entire cost of building a car is transport. And so it's a very important consideration when you look at how do you reshape the economics of transport, what is the impact of transport economics on the rest of the economy, and what are you actually looking for in a just transition? Is it to bring new players on board into transport so you can see here's a new face, or is it to use transport to fundamentally reshape your economy so that everyone has a stake in a new economy? So when we look at it, we've got to be maybe more broad-minded and less focused on a solution that we believe should exist.
Abdool, I've already referred to your book and its title. In a sense, this is a first out of the gate, sort of, so to speak, in terms of the nuts and bolts of how we're going to do this.
Yeah, so globally, over the last few years, there have been things like GLEC 2.0 as a standard, and these are meant to be guidelines on how CO2 emissions need to be reported. But a lot of transport operators don't know what that means. So why do we need to report CO2 emissions? Who is it important to? How do you actually go about reporting emissions? So how do you analyze the emissions of your fleet? And then what do you do about it? That's the critical thing, because, just reporting your emissions means you're understanding the scale of the problem. And it is a huge problem. I was preparing for a conference in 2015, I think it was, and we had about 140 transport companies present at this event. And I asked the question of these CEOs of transport companies, what is the CO2 emissions of your fleet? No one could answer that, right? So I said, okay, so guess what is the emissions of one truck in one day? And people were saying, it must be 10 kilos, 100 kilos, and those kind of numbers. But the reality is that a long-haul truck, Durban to Johannesburg, will emit about 1 ton of CO2 per day. So if you look at the number of trucks on our roads, there's thousands of trucks moving on that freeway every day. So we've probably got about 400,000 trucks on the road in our country. So the CO2 emissions is a huge problem. So the aim of the book was to provide the very first book that explains how to quantify your CO2 emissions and then how to reduce it. Like in baby steps, it's like transport for dummies. So if I could figure it out, anyone could figure it out.
I suspect that isn't quite as simple as that. But what's clear is that we can't keep doing things the way we have always done. The future is changing, and it's changing very quickly. But, we can throw words like trends. Yeah. We can throw words like disruption. What do you see in terms of what's coming?
So I think, in a sense, the future has already arrived. So transport, for about 100 years, we've had, in fact, it's almost exactly 100 years, we've had diesel as a dominant transport technology. And all of a sudden now you have, last about a week ago, we took delivery of the country's first electric truck. The first heavy-duty electric truck was delivered by Volvo to us. And we're the first adopters on the African continent for this. So, in a sense, we're right up there with Europe in terms of deploying the latest technology. But right now we're at the cusp of a whole range of new technologies. So in the next 5 years, we'll probably see the rise of biofuels, LNG, CNG. We've got electric trucks. People are even talking about things like hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. There's hybrid vehicles. There's electrified road systems. So there's a multitude. It's about 7 or 8 different drivetrain options. So, the technology is moving very fast.
It's here. A lot more of it is coming, being on the cusp then of what is to come. Isn't there a danger, though, that almost anyone can be an expert because so much of what is to come is unproven?
Well, that is true. So social media makes experts of everyone, right? So if you can Google something, you're a technical expert. But the reality is, in transport, the devil is always in the detail. So transport achieves the fundamental function of moving things from point A to point B. But to do that, there's an economic impact. So that is generally what we quantify in the transport business. And we're relatively good at that, at understanding what is the cost of transport to the business. But what we're not very good at is looking at things like what is the impact on congestion, on road safety, on CO2 emissions, the external impacts, road damage, that kind of thing. So more and more, I think transport operators need to be held to account in these things. And when we look at these technology shifts, the responsible transport operator has to consider all of these aspects. And what's happening is that there are pulls in certain directions by people who have vested interest. So, for example, if there's a company that has a specific kind of solution, they make it seem as if that's the obvious solution. And then you've got the petrochemical lobby that says, well, why should we move at all? This is the obvious fuel of choice, and the whole climate thing is overplayed. So there's a lot of stuff that comes out in the popular social media that is fueling fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And it's becoming more and more challenging to figure out what is the actual reality. So, what are the real aspects of climate change that we need to take into account? And if you look at things like the recent floods in KZN, these are clear signs that things are changing on a fundamental level. And what we're seeing is the impact of things that have been brewing for a long time. The crazy thing is people think that climate change and the CO2 emission thing is the new thing. But the first paper that was ever published on CO2 in the atmosphere was actually in 1896. 1896, right?
That quickly?
Yeah, that's like 130 years ago, right? Where you had a Swedish scientist by the name of Svante Arrhenius, and he published a paper which was titled "On the Influence of CO2 in the Atmosphere on the Temperature on the Ground." So we knew about this for about 100 years. But there's been a massive rise in CO2 emissions from about 1960, 1950, around there, which has been really the rise of industrial activity. It's a rise of mass transport, so where people could buy cars became really affordable. And we're seeing now we've probably got close to 2 billion cars on the roads globally. And cars are competing with us for air quality. So, they consume air, and we need that stuff we need good quality air.
So let me pick up on two things.
Yes.
I mean, my shock is that it was that quickly noticeable since the start of the Industrial Revolution. Yeah. But in terms of everybody being an expert and all sorts of solutions being offered, let's talk, for example, about hydrogen fuel cells. You're not convinced that's the way to go.
Well, hydrogen fuel cells sounds sexy, right? It sounds like really science fiction stuff, and we've seen them in like the movies on space travel and things like that. But the reality is that when you look at a solution, you got to look at, okay, what is the problem that I'm trying to solve, and what is the optimal way to get there? So hydrogen fuel cells will probably work very well in very few niche applications. And we're talking probably about less than 5% of the total transport application. But if you have to look at where are the optimum solutions, you've got to look at specific use cases. So if you look at urban short haul, delivery cycles that are less than 50 kilometers, less than 100 kilometers. We've got electric trucks on the road that can achieve delivery cycles of 300 to 400 kilometers in a day. So can easily perform more than 50% of the logistics function with an electric truck. Now, if you have to compare hydrogen fuel cell to an electric truck as an example, your capital cost should be more or less around the same, but the electric truck has an overall efficiency of around 74%, which means 74% of the energy that you put in to the system is available to actually move goods. So it's power available at the wheels. Whereas with the hydrogen fuel cell, you actually get around 32%. So you're wasting 2/3 of the energy in a hydrogen fuel cell system. So it's a very energy wasteful system. So in countries where you have massive green electricity production and there's an overproduction, you can store it in hydrogen and then use that hydrogen when it's convenient. But in countries like ours where we are electricity starved, it's not the optimal solution. In fact, I do some work with the University of Cambridge, and they did some studies, and in certain instances where, for example, you've got bus routes, the optimal solution is really going back to what we used to have a hell of a long time ago. So if you remember, our cities had trams. So overhead lines is actually your most efficient solution. So you have a bus, which replaces the tram, so it's a bit more flexible. It's got overhead lines. It charges itself from the lines while it's moving. It has a very small battery, so it can leave the network and do like 10 or 20 kilometers. So these are some really amazing solutions that are being tried overseas.
You talked about our country being, energy starved, at least in terms of electricity. How do we bridge the gap between the coming world, its imperatives, being connected to the global system, and yet facing the very obvious realities of what we are dealing with in South Africa? It's lovely to replace the tram with those buses with overhead lines, except we can barely secure them at the moment.
Well, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the quagmire of where we are, and we're going to look at what are the opportunities and where we can go to. So if we say that we want to navigate to a utopian world, right? So if you want to navigate to a world where transport is effortless, the journeys happen seamlessly and with a minimum impact to the environment, or preferably zero impact to the environment, then we look at solutions around the energy generation. So for example, if you have a bus rapid transit station, you could build that station with solar panels on the roof. And for every 1,000 square meters of panel, you could have probably about 4 buses operating purely on solar energy. So nothing stops us from developing these really sexy solutions. And if we're building infrastructure going forward, then we need to design with the future in mind. So we need to have that future in our imagination and create that future. And we on the African continent, we need to stop being net consumers of technology, and we need to become thought leaders and designers of the future.
So again, facing our realities, one of the touch points about a just transition is going to be the issue of job security. If we're talking about autonomous vehicles, for example, as far as freight is concerned, what does that look like?
So autonomous vehicles will certainly make a huge impact, right? And the impact will be felt in a multitude of different directions. So one is if you have an electric autonomous vehicle, so you don't have a driver. So that means the vehicle does not even have to return to its home base every day. You don't have a person to take care of. But you also don't have a vehicle to take care of, because an electric truck typically will get serviced once a year. So if the vehicle can charge itself at the depot, so it automatically connects to the charger, charges itself. So you have a vehicle that goes from job to job. So the entire transport task actually becomes a lot more efficient, because you've got a reduction in the number of empty journeys. The truck goes from job to job. But also you stand the risk of disintermediation of the transport operator in that space, because the transport operator no longer is responsible for the safety of the driver, the training of a driver, fueling the truck.
Telematics to watch the driver behavior, improving the driver behavior.
So the vehicle itself becomes just a cog in a process. So we actually haven't really fully mapped out what that world could look like in future, but there are huge threats to the driver population without a doubt. And there's a lot of work being done on what do you pivot the drivers to. But globally, there's a driver shortage. So driving is not an aspirational profession. And that's a strange thing, actually. It's a very strange phenomenon, because as kids, we love playing with trucks. And at some point, society gets it out of our head that trucks are cool. And all of a sudden, we all want jobs, white-collar jobs, right? But strangely enough, if you look in most transport companies, your actual admin layer staff gets paid about half of what a truck driver gets paid. But it's just not regarded as a profession that has status in society. And I think that's one of the issues. But over time, autonomous vehicles will certainly reduce the driver population, but labor costs account for between 12 and 18% of the cost of transport. So when we reach a driverless world, the cost of transport comes down. We may actually end up increasing the value that transport provides, and through that we may actually scale up industrial activity. So we may find that there's more jobs created in industry as a result of that sort of transition. So it's difficult to predict where the future is going to be. All we do know is that the future is coming at us very fast, and it's going to be a dynamically changing future because it's a confluence of technology. So previously we had technology waves. So you had steam power, then electricity, and you had these waves that came, and each wave had an impact. So you had like the computer wave, and then you had social media. What we're finding is that the waves are coming faster, and there are now multiple waves attacking us at the same time. So you've got everything simultaneously. You've got IoT, computers, robotics, social media, so interconnected people. You've got 3D printing, all of the stuff happening simultaneously.
But we can also, with respect, imagine a future that doesn't quite arrive. You spoke about taking delivery of the first electric truck, right? In terms of the emerging technologies, I mean, is it going to be a race to this uncertain future, or are we going to be able to take baby steps to get to that transition?
So that's an interesting question. So the early adopters will be taking the baby steps. And what you'll find is, like right now, for example, an electric truck will cost you about, on average, 25% more than a diesel truck to operate. If you had a hydrogen fuel cell truck on the road today, and there are none, if you had one on the road today, it would probably cost you about 50 to 60% more than a diesel truck. So there's that huge cost differential. But if you look at the work of Auke Hoekstra from Technikon Eindhoven, he published some data on what the future battery technologies would be like. And the trajectory of battery technology evolution would mean that probably before 2030, we will see a doubling of range of electric vehicles, and you'll see a halving of battery size for the same range. So what we're finding is that the technology will change dramatically, and roughly by about 2028, 2030, electric transport in general will reach cost parity with petrol and diesel. So you'll find there'll be a point of inflection there in adoption, where all of a sudden, if there's a cost advantage to move with electric, you have to be on that curve. So in Europe, Germany has an 80% tax incentive on electric vehicles for commercial purposes. So when you have that 80% reduction in your capital cost, so an electric truck currently costs 3.5 times the price of a standard diesel truck. So an 80% rebate brings it very close to cost parity, and your operating expenses comes down significantly. So in many parts of Europe, electric trucks, electric freight is a no-brainer. It's economically viable already. Whereas in South Africa, I think we'll wait for cost parity to be achieved on a total cost of ownership basis, and that should arrive somewhere around 2028, 2030. And at that point, you'll see mass adoption.
How do we make sure that in terms of commitments, right, with the other economies that we're doing business with, that we take advantage of the moment, as it were, versus being dragged kicking and screaming?
So that's the purpose of what we're doing, like the early adopters. So we have to, in many instances, take a stab at the new technology, get familiar with it, develop the ecosystem to support it, the charging infrastructure, the work cycles, figure out what has to be changed. And then by the time the technology is mature enough and the solutions can be stretched to a larger use case. So at the moment, we'd like to use our electric truck for short distances. When I say short distances, 75-kilometer trips, 100-kilometer trips. The truck has already done a Durban to Johannesburg trip, so that's easily possible with 2 charging stops. So the early use case will teach us what needs to be done in economic ecosystem development. But as we get more and more familiar with the technology, as we start building better power generation capabilities, which is certainly on the cards, we've got huge power generation projects that are currently being initiated. So in 5 years' time, we will see actually a substantial shift in the availability of green electricity. And together with that, we need to be ready for the new transport technologies.
I feel like as I'm listening to you, I feel like saying, fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be because 5 years is going to be but there are also vested interests. There are established industries in terms of the freight value chain that aren't going to welcome this new world so readily.
Yeah, so it's going to be a very strange environment because Europe has a habit of dumping their used trucks in Africa, right? So that's the one force that will reduce the cost of used trucks in certainly the rest of Africa. In South Africa, we don't get used trucks coming in. So we're going to see some sort of...
But they come in from the rest,
they
bringing
do.
freight.
They do bring freight in. But certainly a lot of the transport operators in South Africa will move to the front end of the curve, and it's going to be a breathtaking transformation. The challenge lies, though, in adjudicating what are the technology options that are available, and it's roughly 7 solution sets that are available, and figuring out what is the most applicable for that use case. So government, from a policy perspective, needs to be enabling. So it needs to make it possible for a lot of these technologies to hit the road. So, for example, in biofuels, there's a whole landscape that needs to be shifted around agricultural development and the development of feedstock for biofuels. And that could be a really good job spinner in our country. And there are a number of projects in that direction that I'm aware of. In fact, we actually had a strong biofuels industry, I think in the 70s in ethanol. Right now, there's a lot that can be done with a whole range of biofuels, specifically to produce biodiesel. Biogases are also a possibility. So we can use the transition potential to secure more jobs in alternative fuels. So, there's policy actually needs to, government needs to figure out, so where do we create enabling policy and what do we actually enable? So, for example, electric trucks in Europe, they have an axle limit allowance because the batteries are heavy, which allows the electric trucks to carry the similar loads as they carry with a diesel truck. We haven't yet had those legislations implemented locally. So government needs to embrace all of these new things. And we've actually had in transport some unsung heroes. I attended an event in Rotorua in New Zealand in 2016. It was a transport conference, and it happens every 2 years. And when I sat in that audience and I heard the presentation, the quality of presentation was amazing. And then I realized that roughly 20% of the presenters were from South Africa, right? So we had some of the best transport thought leadership in the world presenting at that event, right? And a number of those scientists had left the country. But I think the challenge for us is to develop new talent pipelines, so that we can create the new wave of technology locally. But in that event, I also realized that we have in those presentations, a lot of them were on the performance-based standard system for trucks and the smart truck pilot program, which is a huge success story in South Africa. And most people don't even know about it. So what this project has proven through millions of kilometers of testing on the roads is that you can reduce CO2 emissions, you can reduce fuel consumption, you can reduce accidents significantly. And I think they achieved roughly about a 60% reduction in accidents. So this is a success story. What we need is enabling legislation to draw more people into this kind of freight performance.
Certainly is going to need complexity. It's going to need people that are looking for these solutions. But maybe let's dial it slightly back. In terms of even bringing the Internet of Things and those technologies in terms of sensors and tracking freight, what are we seeing in terms of the emerging picture there?
So there's a massive growth in terms of what the sensors can do, the number of sensors you can have, and how you can bring that data together. But we're still at early days with those technologies, because what these technologies do is they give you a lot of data channels, they give you a lot of data points. So we need to arrive into a situation where we have a data repository that can deal with all this information, and we would probably see over time machine learning and AI instruments that interrogate this data and actually simplify what we need to see in it. Because we are just looking for the outliers generally in data sets. We are looking for alarms and exceptions. So we try to manage these things. But as these systems get more and more complex, we actually need to make the way we interpret them more and more simple.
And that's where artificial intelligence is going to be absolutely key. How do you see that playing out?
So what AI will do is AI will take up a lot of the repetitive tasks in what we do, but it will also apply itself to tasks that we don't take seriously enough. For example, the routing of a vehicle, right? So the routing of a vehicle is a fairly complex problem. If you, for example, delivering bread, The AI instrument could actually look at the number of delivery points you have. It could also look at congestion in real time, take actual traffic data and decide on a new route that's optimized better than a human can. So AI will do a lot of things for us that's too complicated for us to be able to think through. And certainly
the ways of the future.
Absolutely, yes. I like that.
I thought I was so clever. The
It's very
ways
clever.
of the future.
Yeah.
Again, it's going to be this delicate dance, right, between embracing those emerging technologies and making sure that we've got the infrastructure to be able to execute them and roll them out.
Yeah. So what's going to happen is that a lot of it is going to become ubiquitous. It's going to get buried in the systems, and we're not going to even have to think about it. I'll give you an example. The fruit industry. So if you've got pallets of oranges that are being exported, so you produce them somewhere inland and you put them on pallets, they go into cold storage. When there's a vessel due to arrive at the harbor, the trucks load them, they go to the harbor, they get loaded on the vessels in containers, and they make this long journey, probably about 3 weeks or so, arrives in Europe or the United States, sits in a warehouse there, and then finally it gets to the shelf. So that's quite a long, drawn-out journey. Now, if each of those pallets have a temperature monitoring sensor, and each one of them uniquely identifies the temperature of that pallet. So if you've got something that's disrupted in your cold chain, anywhere in that journey, before the fruit actually spoils, you can divert that cargo in real time to an alternative destination. So you can, before the cargo spoils, reroute it and take advantage of its current state before it spoils. Now, I think the stats is roughly about 30 to 40% of fresh produce globally gets spoiled.
Okay.
So we can actually eliminate a lot of these wastages. So what you'd find is that these systems would develop into end-to-end processes, and we'd only see what the system needs us to see and action on.
You talked about enabling legislation before. From a regulatory or policy framework point of view, what changes do we need to be able to meet this coming world?
So certainly we need to look at what Europe has already done in enabling things like the electric vehicles. We also need to look at what has been done in places like Australia and New Zealand and some parts of Europe also around the performance-based standard space, and how these projects can reduce the cost of freight and reduce the negative external impacts, while at the same time providing for easier movement of goods. Because the thing is, as society grows and society's needs on freight grows, we need to actually cater for more freight. So, it's a perplexing problem, because you want to reduce the external impacts. People say we don't want trucks on the road. They call them highway monsters. But they don't realize that just about everything that we use in our daily lives, everything that we consume, travels on a truck. I think it's roughly about 86% of the cargo in this country travels on road. So, it's impossible to say, let's just get trucks off the road. It's not going to happen.
So are freight operators preparing for these coming disruptions, these technologies, the new regulations, the sustainable way of doing things in the future?
I think more and more transport operators are seeing the opportunities in that for differentiation of what they're doing. And we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years in most types of business that it's no longer big fish eat small fish. It's fast fish eat slow fish. So those that move with the technology would actually have huge advantages. And, I met a very interesting gentleman in Sweden in a place called Malmö. And he was running a transport company where he didn't own a single truck. So it's a transport cooperative. He had 107 different people who owned trucks, and they operated them either as a single owner driver or a person who owned 2 or 3 trucks. And
so Uber for trucks, essentially.
Something like that, yes. But what he did was, very cleverly, he built an app similar to Uber, and he provided certainty of service. So, for example, if you had a parcel coming to your home, you could choose what time it arrives. So if you said, listen, I'm not going to be at home during the day, I want it to arrive between 6 and 7 in the evening. So then you got a response that said, thank you, we've allocated a driver. Here's his picture. Here's the registration number of his vehicle. Are there any special instructions? So, for example, don't hit the doorbell because I've got a child sleeping, that kind of thing. So he produced that kind of interactivity at the client interface, and that developed a value proposition for him where he specialized in just the delivery of pet food and wine to homes. And he created a whole business around this. Now, it's that kind of imagination and understanding what your client needs. They may not even know, the client may not even know they need that, right? But if you provide a uniquely defined service, you can create a technology platform that serves that. And you're done.
If I pick up on your analogy from earlier on, I don't think it's big fish eating small fish. I think it's big fish eating plantain at this point. But
yeah.
How do operators make sure that they're meeting today's imperatives and priorities and, obviously profits, and keep up pace with what's coming and be ready for the coming world? Or will some operators, or even the majority, be in other industries 5-10 years from now?
So you've really got two different kinds of transport operators. You could look at them in two streams. The one is people who simply move something from point A to point B, right? And then you've got the rest of the industry that says, okay, how can I do this differently? What is my unique selling proposition? Because if you play in the commoditized transport space, then it's just per ton kilometer. This is my rate, and it's a race to the bottom. But if you provide a differentiated service and you say, listen, this is my unique value proposition, this is what I do specially, this is what I do differently. For example, I can respond to your pickup needs within 45 minutes. So if you want something delivered, I can pick it up exactly when you want me to. And if it's a fast delivery, I'll do the fast delivery. If you want me to consolidate in my warehouse and accumulate the deliveries and make a single delivery and reduce the CO2 footprint, I can do that too. So those that provide differentiated services, I think what it comes down to is becoming uniquely customer-centric, understanding what your customer actually needs. So I think that's where it's at. So those that commoditize themselves and start this cost, I need to be the cheapest,
yeah,
and lose their focus on that service, they will eventually fall out the market.
The cynic might though say, hang on, you are being utopian now. I mean, we have to think about the infrastructure that will support all of these changes, electric trucks, charging stations. Quite apart from our energy crunch at the moment, we've got municipalities that aren't able to roll out basic infrastructure, that aren't able to maintain what we already have. What's the rush in South Africa, someone might say?
So we've got a whole lot of infrastructure challenges. That's a fact. But I think the challenge for us is in choosing the right infrastructure to build. So if we know what technology we want to aim for, then we create the sort of infrastructure architecture to match that. For example, instead of having centralized power stations producing huge bundles of energy in certain nodes, we could decentralize that to microgrids, where, for example, a farmer could say, my crops grow better in the shade, so why don't you put solar panels over my crops? And they're doing this in Europe, right? Where I think they call it agrivoltaics. So all sorts of fancy new terms come out for these things. But so the farmer rents the space above his crops, he gets a better crop yield, and you can produce electricity on those solar panels and make it available sort of on in regions where it's underserved with electricity currently. So we're going to have to look at these innovative solutions and develop an infrastructure pathway. So like when you're playing soccer, right? You don't run to where the ball was. You run to where the ball is going. So we need to figure out, where do we want that ball to go?
And of course, I suppose the glass half full perspective is to say developing economies, Africa in particular, has been able in many instances to leapfrog existing technologies to get to where the ball is going. Are there particularly unique things about where we find ourselves that could actually make us leaders and game changers ourselves?
I did a workshop in Tanzania about a month and a half ago, and it was my first visit to this country, and I expected to see a country that's stuck in the middle of Africa somewhere, a little bit backward. I honestly had very low expectations, and it was fundamentally wrong of me. When I got there, it was a workshop of about 92 people representing about 45 transport companies, and they were there to hear about how they could transform their industry, right? So it was something that took me by surprise. We did a book launch there. We had TV coverage, newspaper coverage. And what was funny was I visited a workshop, and the company showed me an app that they had created. And on this app, they do vehicle inspection. So they inspect the truck and trailer using an app, so that make sure that the technician does not miss out a single thing. And whatever he reports on that inspection goes to a central database and gets actioned. So the manager at the depot sees all of this in real time. He sees an exception report on his vehicles. I did not expect to see a solution like that on the African continent. And that was developed in Tanzania by local people. So we're talking about like a first world, best in class solution on the African continent. If they can do it, we can do it.
And there are many other opportunities, I would imagine, just in terms of, road safety technology, for example, collision avoidance systems.
Absolutely. So coming back to what we're doing in Africa. So there's a company in Cape Town called Go Metro. They're advising people in Hong Kong. They're advising in the UK on mass transit. So how do you move people around a city most efficiently, right? So we've got these pockets of excellence. We've got a company in Johannesburg, I think they're called GeoInt, and they provide geospatial intelligence. They are designing an intelligence system that uses GPS coordinates and route data to actually create a hybrid interaction between the diesel drivetrain and electric drivetrain on a hybrid truck. So there's this hybrid truck project in the UK called Ajero, right? And what they had was an energy system that you install on a diesel truck where you could use the braking energy, put that into a storage unit, and then use it for acceleration. So you reduce your fuel consumption by about 20 to 30%, right? So it's just a hybrid system. But it had no intelligence. It just worked on the brake and accelerator actions. So this company in Johannesburg built a system here in South Africa that uses the best technology available globally, geospatial intelligence, to teach that truck how to optimize the energy between the diesel and the electric. I mean, that's a world first, right? And that's being produced in South Africa. So we actually do have technology excellence. It's just a matter of the visibility and the support for it. If that company was in California, there'd be venture capital companies throwing hundreds of millions of dollars at this company. But the companies in South Africa are bootstrapping and doing it with hundreds of thousands of rand.
And is there a concern around even working in silos, whether sectoral or even industry, where in fact we should be meeting around a table, collaborating? I mean, let's talk risk, for example, and insurers. There are so many innovations that one could be discussing that work for everyone. It's a win-win for all of us.
Yeah. So in terms of risk, you've got technology that reduces risk and technology that measures risk. So reducing risk, for example, what you mentioned earlier, the collision avoidance system. We've had these around on our Volvo trucks now since 2019 or so, where if the traffic slows down, the truck slows down. If the traffic stops, the truck stops, right? So you've got these technologies. You've also got technologies in cameras that observe the driver. So you're not actually looking at the driver, but the technology monitors the driver's condition. And it can actually tell you when the driver is becoming drowsy. So it can send an alert to the base station, to the control room to say, listen, this driver on this vehicle, he looks like he's getting drowsy. And then you can take action there. But also from a risk mitigation point of view, you can better predict certain fleets that have good behavior compared to other fleets. And you do this through risk profiling using their telematics. So that the insurance companies can actually make a better risk assessment. And if you manage your fleet correctly, they can reduce your actual insurance premium as a result.
Other things we just maybe haven't even thought about. We're talking about road freight essentially for this conversation, but where do things like drone delivery and moving things that way, I mean, that could also have potential to grow.
Absolutely. So I was in Germany in 2018 at the IAA in Hanover. It's a truck show. And in the one hall, there was a minibus. And people were crowded around this thing, and I couldn't understand what the fascination was until I realized that this minibus actually had two drones that sat on its roof, right? So you load parcels in cages into the back of this minibus, and this minibus goes off on the freeway, and the drones pick up the parcel and do last mile delivery. So the minibus doesn't even have to go into the suburbs, right? Now that's amazing, right? So these drones, there's no operator. The drones take the parcels, drop them off, and come back, right? So that's just one direction. What we could also see is, and I think there are some pilot projects in Africa around things like blood samples.
Yeah.
Right? Where drones are being used.
Space.
Yes, in the medical space. So even in South Africa, you've got path labs where blood samples have to move around from hospitals to labs and you've got cars that are moving around little boxes with samples. A drone could do that so easily. So we are going to see at some point drones taking over a lot of the smaller transport tasks and a lot of the last mile delivery legs. We're going to have to see serious legislation around how to control that. The drones will actually have to become self-managing communities in their airspace so that drones don't collide with each other. And we're going to see things like people hijacking drones. It's going to be a unique problem to solve. But I think it holds a lot of opportunity, especially for small parcel delivery. Now imagine you order a pizza, right? And that pizza comes to you within a minute or two, simply delivered by a drone. It arrives, tracks your phone, and it arrives, delivers to your hand. I mean, what a pleasure.
And bye-bye delivery guy, right? Pizza delivery man. Let's talk, though, about this recently released report, right? The Climate Pathways and Just Transition Project South Africa. Zero emissions by 2050?
So zero emissions by 2050 is a difficult target. I think our green transport strategy, which may be a bit outdated by now, it only talks about a 5% reduction by that time. So zero emissions by 2050 is a lofty goal. Certainly as a business, we've set a target for zero emissions by 2040. But in a single business, you can actually take the steps to achieve that. But the report that you mentioned, it looks at various technology options and it tries to map a way forward, and it provides some sort of policy guidelines. But if you look at that same report objectively, though, there's a graph, I think, on page 38, which looks at alternative technology choices, and it looks at the scenario window from about 2020 to about 2040. And around 2030, it predicts that hydrogen fuel cells trucks will be the cheapest way of moving freight.
You disagree?
I disagree with that because I've done the calculations, right? And if you look at the capex cost equivalent, and if you look at the fact that the hydrogen fuel cell truck uses 3 times the amount of electricity, then the operational cost difference will certainly give you an OPEX cost drawback. So my prediction is that it will be about 30 to 40% more expensive than an electric truck. And the funny thing is, in the fine print below that graph, it says the electric trucks have been excluded from this analysis. Now, if you want to exclude the most obvious solution, you can arrive at a suboptimal answer. The danger with that is a number of our municipalities are looking at hydrogen fuel cell buses.
Based on a report like that?
Yeah, so there have been other reports earlier on that suggested hydrogen fuel cells would work. And the early adopters in Europe have moved away from the hydrogen fuel cell buses and are now looking at different things like electric buses, but also buses with overhead lines for charging. So, they're looking at more innovative solutions and not hung up on what sounds sexy. Because ultimately, if the solution is 30 to 40% more expensive, it's the man in the street who's going to pay for it. And we as an economy can ill afford to make these missteps. So I think what government needs to do is we need to create a new alignment where we start looking more towards our universities to give us technology guidance. So in South Africa, we actually have a very nice arrangement between universities and industry, which is the Center for Sustainable Road Freight. So it's an offshoot of the one at Cambridge University. And it ties institutions like, I think it's Wits University, Stellenbosch, Swane, together into an apparatus that can actually do applied research for industry. And we've done some great work recently on tires. And it can also provide policy guidance to government.
So you've got a nice analogy. You say that report is like looking for?
It's like looking for a wife, but excluding women, right? So, if you want to adjudicate technology options, then what you need to do is you need to list all of them, look at them objectively, define the pros and cons. And what you'll find is that for specific use cases, certain ones rise to the top, right? Then you've got to look at things like, what is the current technology maturity? What are the ecosystem constraints? What ecosystem can you navigate to? Is it worth overcoming those hurdles? Because you need to look at what is our current state, what is our future state, what is the most desired future state? And ultimately what we're looking for is something that serves society best. That's really what we need to navigate to.
From a transport sector sort of ground up, what does the sector need to be considering in order to achieve net zero emissions?
I think for a start, what the industry needs is to recognize that it is a problem that needs to be solved, right? And then the first step is to understand what is our current CO2 emission. So everyone who operates a vehicle needs to be able to put up their hands and say, listen, I need to learn this stuff. So the tragedy is, though, that the guidelines in Europe, the EN 16258 and the GLEC 2.0, are like 80 to 120 page documents. It's crazy. So that's why one of the things I did earlier on, about 4 or 5 years ago, was I looked to condense those into a 4-page guideline. Right. So I share this with transport operators who are looking to reduce their emissions. And I advise a few large global players also on this. And so the first step is, figuring out how to calculate the emissions and then looking at, okay, so what can I do about it? And the funny thing is that there are so many simple steps you can do right now with your existing fleet. So we've proven that you can reduce your CO2 emissions by about 20% using the existing trucks. Right. So there's no need to wait for electric trucks or hydrogen or whatever sexy solution is on the horizon. Work with what you've got and make it work better.
And we've already seen some major changes in so-called green logistics. I mean, let's talk tires, for example. There's already been impact with much more to come.
Yeah. So in our fleet, I did a study over about 400,000 kilometers in 2017, where I compared 3 different tire choices. I didn't want to rely on the tire vendors for the data because everyone says their stuff is the best. So what I did was I bought 3 different tire types, and I sent samples to Wits University. They did rolling road studies at the university. I compared it to the data I was actually getting from my fleet. And in doing that, I found that just the tire change alone was responsible for an 8% reduction in my fuel consumption. So fuel consumption correlates directly to CO2 emissions. So that means an 8% reduction in my CO2 emissions. And I got that just with that one step. We went further. We improved our alignment protocols. We improved our balancing. We did our pressure monitoring. We did weighbridge studies. And in that entire basket, we got to about a 12% improvement, right? And this is cash flow positive. It means you're making more money, right? So it's a no-brainer. So you're doing the right thing and you're making more money. I mean, how can you go wrong?
Abdool Kamdar, may I give you a new name?
Go for it.
I feel like you're Aladdin and you've just taken me on a magic carpet ride.
But it's a whole new world.
It is a whole new world.
Absolutely.
And it is here. Yeah. And if you're a transport operator, if you're a freight operator, you better pay some attention to make sure you are treading in the right direction.